Welcome. Happy to see everybody today. This is Take the Lead, Change the Game, a podcast for women leaders looking to deepen their knowledge and skills and find enjoyment in the process. We're powered by Software Leadership. Software Leadership is a cohort-based coaching experience designed to fuel courage and ignite impact among women professionals. I am Mindy Galati, and this is Lindsay Gray, and we're the co-founders of Safra. Together, we bring a blend of leadership coaching, strategy, and lived experience to help women navigate challenges, seize opportunities, and lead with confidence. And I'm excited to be here with you today to talk about grief, change, and the workplace. Heavy topic, but something that I think is timely for a lot of people and something that a lot of folks experience. Thanks for joining, Lindsay.
Yeah, of course. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Today, we're going to talk about, as Mindy mentioned, grief, change, and the workplace. Today, we're going to focus specifically on when things happen at your workplace and also that directly affect your work. Next week, we're going to talk about sort of when those things happen outside of the workplace, when things happen in your personal life or the personal life of a colleague or a friend at work, and sort of how to manage those things. So, Mindy, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so Lindsay and I were, we've talked about this topic because earlier this year, I lost somebody that I had been working with for quite some time. One of my actually coaching clients and a law firm partner that I had been working with for a couple of years. And it was really tough. And it just reminded me of when we lose somebody that we work with. It's often a very unusual experience because they're not our family member, but people we work with are who we spend a lot of our life with. And so that's sort of the framing of where this came from. I've actually experienced a couple people close to me that I work with pass away over the last couple of years. And it's been like an interesting thing to go through, both emotionally, but also as a leader and somebody who has to continue to do work. And what does that look like? We also want to talk a little bit about today about like transitions. So grief isn't just when somebody dies. It's also when, people leave your workplace, if there's layoffs at a workplace. For those of us who are attorneys, loss of clients who have been, some of my clients were put in jail for a very long time. Some of Lindsay's clients faced deportation and were deported. And so we're going to talk about all of that today. But really what I want us to think about, and maybe everybody who's watching, is just think of a time when you experienced a death or a loss at work, and kind of how did you navigate that? How did your company or your organization navigate that? And we're gonna provide some tips based on sort of our just lived experience and what we went through. But I'll start with sort of the most recent person in my life that passed away. He passed away actually on my birthday in August, and he was a law firm partner that I worked with, and he was just so fantastic. And I had just been at his firm 3 days before he passed away, and he was in the middle of a deposition, so I didn't get to see him. Went and saw his secretary and said, "Hey, I'll be back in a couple weeks," and stopped by. And when I got the news, it was obviously, my experience was, shock and then sadness. But kind of what immediately started happening was, well, how do we continue on with the work at the firm? Like, what is it going to be like when I go back there? And the things that I, kind of observed in the last, few weeks of work, still working with this firm, which I'll still be working with for hopefully years to come, is grief is really different for everyone. And so this situation was interesting in that I was back at this firm to do work about 17 days after he passed away. And the day before, I called the firm and said, we're still good? Are we okay to do this? And yes, come on, let's, we have to keep moving forward. And I drove to Houston, and for the whole 3 hours, I was really like, how am I going to show up? Because I was sad, but we had work to do. That's not my firm. I'm not there every day. So it was awkward to feel like, is my grief is not as much as theirs. And what if I cry, and should I cry? And all of those emotions were going through. And as I talked to people at the firm, everybody was experiencing it very differently. And everybody was, some people, work was a welcome respite from the grief. Okay, it's fun. Let's get back to work because I need the distraction. from the grief, from the sadness. And then for some people, they just were really having a hard time getting the work done. They were having a hard time actually sitting in front of the computer and getting, back in the swing of things, because maybe it didn't feel like it mattered much anymore. So that's, that's something that I've been going through. And what I would say, watching the leadership team of this firm, that I think is really important, is that they really have given everybody sort of their own space to do what they need to do to make it through this. Meaning there's not this, hey, just get back to work. It's very much do what you need to do to serve your clients. But we understand how everybody is doing. And I think it's been a very emotionally grounded environment for people. And even me being an outsider, but being somebody who's attached to the firm, I feel that care from them as well, as hey, how are you doing? And you show up how you need to show up, and don't worry if you're sad, or don't worry if this is hard for you. You just be who you are. So I think that's been really interesting. Any thoughts, Lindsay?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of that is incredibly helpful, and it's great that your most recent experience with loss was sort of affiliated with a firm that really was supportive of not only you, of course, but their team. Another thing I guess I'll say, just in terms of reflections on this specific topic, which is grief, sometimes we do just need to step away for the rest of the day. I mean, I remember, grief in terms of not death, but losing a big case. I mean, Mindy, we're both former public defenders. I used to be an immigration practitioner, owned an immigration firm. And there's a lot of loss, right? Which can really affect people's lives. I mean, maybe the client is going to prison for the rest of their lives, or maybe a client is being deported and they'll be in lots of danger, if they are deported. And there's a lot of grief that comes with that, especially after we pour our hearts and souls into the case. And so, go home, obviously make sure that your auto away is on, but as a leader, make sure that your folks have space and time to sort of process those things, figure out what has to get done, and what, who or whoever's experiencing the grief has to do, potentially what can get farmed out. And then give some, meaningful period of space and time, and then provide as much support as possible as the person, even if it's just the next day, coming sort of back to sort of the normal productivity level.
Yeah.
The primary way that I have recently experienced sort of grief and change is when I started transitioning out of the CEO role of the nonprofit organization that I founded. So, it's funny, a year after I started the organization, a dear friend of mine who runs a community foundation was like, you better start working on your transition plan. And I was like, what? I'm only a year in. But I think as someone who has witnessed, hundreds, if not thousands of nonprofit organizations have founders and CEOs that transition in and out, he knew that would happen. And so this topic is interesting self-reflection for me. And I'd be curious to talk to my own team about what support I provided and potentially didn't, because I think it is easy to think about, ourselves, and it's I'm transitioning, everyone will be fine.
Yeah.
I do think I provided, some meaningful support, had lots of conversations, and tried to really take care of making sure that, my interim replacement and then ultimately my long-term replacement were well positioned. But it's hard. And the relational thing is challenging, because you're never going to have the same relationship. I mean, similar to your story about 20 years, I was 5, but also it's starting an organization from the ground up. And so it's difficult to transition out of that role.
Yeah. And that brings up, there's obviously the grief that goes with, the death of someone that you work with, which I do think is something that's not talked about enough at work, which is when you have a colleague die, they're not your family, but they are your family. think of how much time you spend with your coworkers. So if they die, it is a very tough situation. And some companies handle it well, some firms handle it well, but others don't. But also, I think it's complicated. At least it's been for me. I've had 2 close colleagues die. And to feel like I don't want to act like this impacts me more than others, but it does. It impacts me, you know, their family obviously more, but that's been an interesting kind of internal reflection. But the other thing is, you know, even if someone doesn't die that you work with, when people leave, so you're talking about your transition, it was a few months ago, and I was talking to somebody that I was coaching, and one of his colleagues who they had worked together for almost 20 years, 19 years since they graduated, and they started at this company. And, you know, he told me, he said, or his colleague was leaving for a new job. Normal, people leave, people go to different companies. And, you know, he said to me, like, I just have this overwhelming sense like I'm not going to be close to her like I have been. And it's true, because they'll remain friends and they'll still talk to each other. And, you know, but think of when you've been working with somebody for 20 years, like you've went through marriage and kids and life and growth, and then they go to another company and you're used to meeting with that person maybe every day, at least every week. And so now they're at a different company, you're not going to have that same engagement, and it's a loss, and there is grief. And when this person told me this, I said to him, I said, you're going through grief. So don't act as if this is just like, oh, well, she didn't die and we'll be fine, we'll be friends. Sure, you'll be friends, but it does change the nature of your relationship and the closeness. And, you know, Lindsay and I, like, we do this podcast every week. If this podcast didn't exist, we wouldn't have this time together each week. And so I do think inside of your work, you have to recognize when you're going through this, because there are things like layoffs. People do quit companies and go somewhere else. And I get really attached to people, and I love people, and I sort of pour into people. So as a consultant now, and as an attorney, you know, your clients go, so I'm going to lose my client. And I do have a hard time. So I go back and say, this is how I'm feeling. It's totally normal. Work through the grief, you know, share it appropriately with people. And I think that's, you know, been my journey. The one thing you brought up, Lindsay, though, that I think is interesting is when I was a public defender, one of the leaders at the public defender's office says, you'll have these moments where you lose, or it's a really tough day. And at the public defender office I worked at, they'd say, take a mental health day or take a mental health afternoon. And, you know, he told me early on in my career, find something that you really like, that's accessible and easy to go do when you have this moment. Don't just go home, because you need to like go process it. And if you go home and you're busy, you may start to work. And it was really interesting because where I worked in Orange County, we were by Disneyland. So a lot of us had season passes to Disneyland. And my courthouse was 1.5 miles from Disneyland. And I would leave work and just go to Disneyland alone. And sometimes my spouse would come, but I would just like walk around, because it was so overwhelming what had just happened, those losses. And I think we have to be mindful about what are the things that we do to give ourselves some space when, you know, traumatic and really sad things happen at work.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny that you say Disneyland, because you know what I was thinking about?
Yeah.
In Austin, they have a smash room where you can literally like pay to go and take a hammer and smash things. So, you know, there's two sides of that coin, Disneyland or the smash room. Yeah. And there's lots of stuff in between. Paddle boarding is maybe like a nice middle ground.
Yeah.
It's so funny.
Yeah.
But we all do things in our own way. And to be perfectly honest, like sometimes I experience grief and change and loss in a way where I want to go to Disneyland. And some days I want to go to the smash room.
Yeah. And some days you want to go just sit outside and let it out and cry, you know? And so I think it's important. I think for leaders, some of the sort of leadership advice and tips that I've had, that I have witnessed, I've had leaders do this for me. I do this with my clients, you know, when I'm coaching them, is always recognize that grief is very different for everyone, and none of us experience things the same way. And so, when we have to get back to work, so let's say you're leading a team and there's been a death at your firm or at your company, or a key person has left and it's a significant impact. A lot of times we know how we feel, and we can unconsciously and for kind of normal reasons think everyone's feeling that same way. You got to be mindful that not everyone's going to process it the same way. So you want to make sure that you are listening to your team, you're listening to people, how are you doing? You're giving people space for grieving how they need to grieve. As a leader, oftentimes you still have to get work done. So how do you lead a productive team when you've had a death in your organization, or when as an attorney, when you get back to your office and you just lost a case, or one of your clients dies, or one of your clients is deported? What do you do? Well, you do need to have a playbook, meaning I think everybody before something like this happens should just write kind of a couple things to keep in mind. And some of that is, having the emotional intelligence around your team. Some of it is around, grief is different for everyone, but also recognize that sometimes working is helpful to people. Meaning, sometimes as leaders we'll be like, oh, we don't need to do this, or we don't need to work on this. But for some people, it's helpful for them to turn off the sadness and the grief and work. Now, there are a lot of people that's not the best thing. So you have to lead by, going to the individual person. But what I have seen at organizations sometimes is when something tragic happens, is we'll sort of tell people well, you don't need to work, or we're not going to work on this right now. But oftentimes people need that. People need routine. They need to get up and they need to do the same thing because it helps pull them through. And so, make sure you're listening, make sure you're giving people space, but also give yourself space, because as a leader, it will feel uncomfortable to say, okay, folks, we have a deliverable, or we have a trial coming up, or we have things that have to get done, even though we're all a puddle of tears. And I don't think there is one answer. I think the one answer is you have to be really responsive to the people around you. You have to listen. You have to encourage dialogue. That's why the pre-planning is important, because you want to build that trust. So when things like this happen, you can talk about them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the playbook can also be similar to the playbook that you have when somebody's out sick, right? We should always know in advance, if so-and-so got hit by a bus, what are we all going to do? And so figuring that out and adapting it, hopefully it's, when someone needs to be out because it's been an emotional challenge, it's not the same as that person just suddenly not being there forever, but sort of adapting to that, I think is super helpful. And then really being supportive as the person comes back, and making sure that sort of workload is manageable. And ultimately, potentially having some honest conversations about okay, these are the deliverables and the outcomes that we have in front of us. How are we going to execute?
Yeah. I do think it's always important to pre-plan. And people get sick, people get in car accidents. I've seen dozens and dozens of people get medical conditions that take them out. And you want to have the plan so that you can allow for the grief. Yes. So what the plan does is it allows you to let people grieve, because if you have the plan ahead of time, at least a semblance of what you would do, then when the thing, or if the thing happens, you can focus on the care, the compassion. Because if you're scrambling to get something, and because in law firms, people don't care if somebody dies when there's a statutory deadline or a trial or clients who need you. And that may sound callous, but that's why you have to have the pre-plan, right? Yeah. You have to think about it so that you can allow people to grieve, so that you can give that space for care. The other thing too is, I've experienced with several clients that I've worked with, layoffs and, reductions in force. And I think that is another area where, as a leader, you need to think about how to handle the grief that's involved. Yeah. And it's not just for the person who gets laid off. They obviously have their emotions, their grief, what they're going through, but the people left behind, in a riff or the people left, I mean, I work with those people. I've done focus groups with those people, and there is a very heightened sense of emotion. And a lot of times you as a leader have to rebuild a lot of trust, because
100%.
they're like, am I next? Am I on the chopping block next?
Yeah.
And so if you're ever dealing with rifts or acquisitions, if a company acquires your company, there is a sense of panic that happens. And so all of this is grief and change and loss, whether it's actual loss of life or loss of job or loss of opportunity. And I would say as a leader, we've kind of said this over and over, but have some sort of plan ahead of time, so that you can give space for the grief, because I think that's how we create workplaces that are, that really thrive, is when you're able to do that. And this firm that I'm working with, I mean, they have been just remarkable, because they have given people that space, because they did have a plan, hoping that it would never happen, but unfortunately it did.
Sometimes it does. Yeah, definitely. It creates much more resilient workplaces across the board.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, we could talk about this for a long time. Next time when we get together, like you said, Lindsay, we're going to talk about how to handle grief that's outside of work. So when you have personal things happening, how do you lead through those emotional times when the forces are external? So
yeah, definitely. Looking forward to it as much as one can, since it's a heavy topic. But
well, thanks for being with us, everyone. We appreciate you.
Yeah, have a great rest of your week and a good weekend.
Bye.